So, welcome back. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about evolution. I'm going to introduce the topic. So, it's just an overview of some of the major principles of the matter. And so, evolution itself is a change in a population's genetic composition over the course of generations. That's a generic overall statement about what evolution as a macro idea is. Now, here in AP Biology, we are going to evaluate evolution at a level that is more measurable. Right? We want actual numbers because it's science. And the way of perceiving evolution that allows us to do that is by looking at it in the view of what's called microevolution. So microevolution is specifically shifts in allele frequencies within a population over the course of generations. So rather than this just like vague, like there's a change in the population over generations, this is very specifically the frequency at which different alleles show up within that population's gene pool. So very measurable, very sciencey, much preferable to our generic evolution definition. So moving forward, when I talk about evolution, right, unless otherwise stated, I'm talking about microevolution. So there are 5 driving forces of evolution. These are the things that make evolution work the way that it does. And so the 5 driving forces are natural selection, sexual selection, gene flow, mutation, and genetic drift. Now, very often you'll see natural selection and sexual selection grouped together under the generic term selection. They work very similarly. Mutation is very often grouped with genetic drift. Okay? I think that they're very distinct, separate things, but very often, due to the nature of genetic drift as a general concept, the randomness of mutation is often lumped in together. Okay? But these are the 5 distinct things that are causing populations to evolve. Okay? So the first force, natural selection. Now, this is what you usually think of when you think about evolution, right? This is survival of the fittest. This is when one phenotypic variation has a survival advantage over other variations of that phenotype. Now, it's very important that you make the distinction here that it is a phenotypic variation, right? Because this has to do with the environment impacting the survival of these organisms. And so genotypes cannot be perceived by environmental pressures. Only the phenotype can be. And so if you're dealing with something like a dominant and recessive trait, right, the environment doesn't care if the organism is homozygous dominant or heterozygous. They both look the same to the environment, right? And so the environment can only select for the phenotype and not those genotypic differences. This is very important when it comes to conserving recessive traits within a population, because that heterozygote organism can pass recessive traits on, even though the recessive variation of the phenotype would have died. The important aspect of this whole storyline that comes into play with natural selection is that dead organisms can't pass on their genes. So the winner of evolution is going to be whoever passes on the most of their genes. It's not about who's the best at living or who's the fastest or who's the coolest, right? It's about who's making the most babies. That's who's winning evolution. Now, through the effects of natural selection, our population average trait will shift towards advantageous phenotypes at any given point in time. Right? And so our average trait for a phenotype is usually the most fit trait. And given enough generations, it will always be the most fit trait because that's the one that will show up the most. Okay? And so we have some little graphs over here for different types of selection, which we will talk about at more length during its own unique lecture. Okay? But we have stabilizing selection, right? And that's when the phenotype that is already the most prevalent is the most beneficial. And so the things that are less of that mean will end up dying off. So if you're shorter or you're taller and medium height is good, those short and tall will die off. Right? And so the population mean will narrow out to be this medium height. You have directional selection. This is when one phenotype has an advantage over the pre-existing phenotype. So maybe the environment has changed, or you get this new variation that's better than the old variation. Either way, in this particular model, right, the black moth has an advantage over the white peppered moth. And so that average mean shifts towards the black moth. And in diversifying selection or disruptive selection, there are two phenotypes on either end of the spectrum away from the mean, and they're both more advantageous than the original mean was itself. Again, environmental changes can lead to this. Right? And so you'll see a shift towards two new means. Right? And so rather than having one mean phenotype, you have two mean ones. Okay? Mean as an average, not mean as an angry. Just some sourcing, since I stole this picture from this website. So I give a little credit. Okay? And now the level of advantage that you have, because you have the cool phenotype, is called your fitness. Right? And so you can have a low fitness if you have a bad phenotype. You can have a very high fitness if you have the best phenotype. That's your fitness. The next driving force, selection of sexual nature. Right? So we got sexual selection. So this is when a variation in a phenotype provides advantage in gaining mates. So this isn't about living, this is about specifically making babies. Okay? So you have one variation that allows you to make babies more readily than the other variations of that phenotype. And there are two types of sexual selection. There's intersexual, and that's when one sex has a preference for a trait variation in the other sex. So the female is choosing which male to mate with, or the male is choosing which female to mate with on a consistent basis of this trait. So this isn't about like individual preference, right? Like, you know, I could like redheads and Billy could like brunettes. Like that's not going to lead to a shift towards one or the other. Okay. But now if all of the humans like redheads, we would shift towards redheads, right? And so best example, well, not best, but a very clear example of this in real life is peacocks. Right? And so here we have a peacock, and here we have a peahen. Okay? So now the peacock obviously has this giant, huge, beautiful tail thing. Right? And now imagine being a bird, and you're living in the woods, and you got this big, stupid-ass tail running behind you. You're trying to get through the trees. You got a wolf chasing you, right? You get this giant tail. Not a good survival strategy here. Right? And so the only reason the peacock has this giant tail is because this peahen right here is more attracted to that giant tail than a small tail, right? And the benefits of being able to make the babies with the females outweigh the benefits of being able to run away from the wolves in this particular species evolutionary development, right? And so this peahen has been selected through natural selection, whereas the peacock has been selected through sexual selection, okay? So survival traits, this is what it would look like if it wants to live, and this is what it looks like if it wants to have babies. Okay? Sexual versus natural selection within the same species. The peacock's the male, the peahen's the female. Alternatively, we have intrasexual competition. And this is when the selection is done within the same sex. Right? And so there's a competition between two males, for instance, and that competition decides who gets to mate. The female is not the one choosing. It's whoever wins this competition. Right? And here I have an image of elks headbutting to assert dominance. And then the dominant male will get to go mate with the females, whereas the losing male has to not. Right? So that's intrasexual sexual selection. The next force is gene flow, which really you can just think of as immigration and emigration. And so this is when outside individuals come and visit a population. Okay? They come to a new place, they intermingle, okay? Or some of your group leaves and they go elsewhere. Okay? This is the exchange of genes. Okay? Now, in order for these population changes to occur, either that new population has to come in and stay, right? If a population moves in and just lives there, right, that changed the allele frequency instantaneously, right? As soon as they came here, I got more of whatever alleles they had. And so if they came from the red desert and they flew into the blue desert, that moment that they arrive, I have more red alleles, right? Instantaneous microevolution. Also, the population from when they left, their allele frequency has now changed somewhat. Right? The other way that this can impact a population's allele frequency is if some group just comes and visits, and then while they're here, they mate, right? We make some babies together, and then they leave. Okay, so they've left some of their genes behind, and they've taken some of our genes with them, okay? And that's gene flow as well. So either circumstance results in an instantaneous change in allele frequency for both populations involved. Mutation. Mutation is extremely important for the story of evolution because it is the origin of all the new variations. Right? So any new phenotype that we're looking at is the result of a mutation within the DNA. Right? So we have these random changes in DNA, and the randomization of mutation is very, very, very important, right? Because it's very important that we do not think of evolution as a directional event. Right? It doesn't have an end game. It's not trying to make perfect organisms. Okay? A random change occurs, and if that change is advantageous, it stays around and becomes more prevalent. And more often than not, that change is actually detrimental. And so that organism will die off, and that change disappears into the annals of history. Right? And so these random mutations are very important for evolution, but they are very random. They can occur at a point level where you have small changes, right? And so this might be a change in the protein structure that allows for you to have gray fur instead of brown fur, right? There's not a huge change there. Okay, small changes, small variations, new alleles. It can also be chromosomal. I could have a huge change in the way that my chromosomes are arranged. And so maybe I have a non-disjunction event, and now I have 2 copies of chromosome 7 where I used to have 1 copy of it. And so now that changes the way that my genome is set up, and that changes the way in which I can mate with the organisms that used to be within my population. Right? And so that's a way to start a whole new subspecies of organism. Usually, again, more often than not, mutations are detrimental because you're changing something that works already, but occasionally they're beneficial. And then finally, we have genetic drift. And genetic drift are all non-selective shifts in allele frequency. Okay, so this is when random stuff changes your allele frequency. Okay, and so this can be things like giant natural disasters. Right? So if you have a population, right, let's say that a population in the United States, we have people over in California and we have people here in Massachusetts. Right? Let's say that the distribution of Asians is higher in California than it is here in Massachusetts. Right? And so there's certain phenotypes that Asians have that we wouldn't have less of here, right? And so California has a higher Asian phenotype than Massachusetts has. Okay, an earthquake destroys California. California's gone. Everybody in California died. They're all dead. Okay, our allele frequency has just shifted, right? It didn't have anything to do with the phenotype of the people in California. They didn't die because they had the Asian phenotype. They died because there was an earthquake, right? But they're dead, and our allele frequency changed. Okay? And so that can happen. There's also something called the founder's effect. And so if you have, for instance, a small group of adventurers leave the mainland and they go to an island, right? Their allele frequency of that small population, that small subset, is most likely going to be different than the allele frequency of the major population from which they left. Right? And so that island now will have a different allele frequency than the main population had. Okay? And the descendants of that island are going to be impacted by whatever that original distribution was. There's also the fact that there's just statistical randomness, right? And so some events that are improbable can still happen. If I were to flip a quarter 100 times, I could theoretically flip 100 heads. Could happen. Right? And so if I have a small population and they're making babies, right? Maybe, just maybe, right? All the babies are born homozygous recessive. Could happen. It's very unlikely, but it could happen. Right? And then if I have all my babies homozygous recessive, that dominant allele is gone. It's out of that population. It doesn't exist anymore. Just randomness, right? Just happened. Couldn't help it. Just happened. Right? And so that's genetic drift. So those are all the forces that drive evolution. Again, evolution is a change in a population's genetic composition over the course of generations. More specifically, we'll consider the change in allele frequency within a population over generations. Okay. It's a completely randomly derived event, and it's driven by selective forces. So it is non-directional. It does help organisms better suit their environment through natural selection. Sometimes it makes them not suit their environment very well through sexual selection. Right? But it is all very random based, and we can't create new traits to fit our environment. It just has to happen randomly through mutation. And yeah, we'll talk more about evolution as we go on. I love evolution. Have a great day. Bye.